Good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening. We are continuing our study on the book of Revelation. At this time, we're looking at chapter 5. And I just wanted to remind you that as we were studying chapter 4 last Sunday morning, that the writer John infuses Old Testament imagery with new meaning. He takes passages from the prophets especially, like Ezekiel and Daniel and Isaiah and others, and uses the imagery that he finds there in ways that apply to Jesus Christ and the early church. In the 7 churches of Asia Minor, they were facing persecution in the time of the Roman emperors, and this letter was going to give them strength, admonition, and information to prepare themselves and to focus on their faith in the midst of the trials and tribulations that they were enduring. And of course, one of the things that we were thinking about on Sunday morning was to view the throne room in chapter 4. At least one way to think about it is the imagery of a strategic war room in time of political crisis. For example, during the Second World War, we have a picture here that you can see on the screen of Sir Winston Churchill of England and his advisors as they were planning to deal with the threat of Nazism and Adolf Hitler during the Second World War. And so they were strategizing, they were thinking about various ways in which they can deal with the enemy. And a lot of times the imagery of warfare is used to look at certain strategies, plans of attack, geographical advantages, and so forth. And in the case of the Second World War, there was also the problems with airplane attacks as well. So I'm just saying that this is one way to really help us to think about some of the imagery that we see, and what I read in Revelation 4 and 5 really seems like thinking about the war room in heaven, and God is planning to set out a war against the enemies of God and the people of God, and this is some of the imagery that John is describing for us in this letter. I'd like to just think about chapter 5 with you as we look at this, and we continue the reading here. And let's just look at the first 5 verses here. And I saw in the right hand of him who was seated on the throne a scroll written within and on the back, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?" And no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look into it. And I wept much that no one was found worthy to open the scroll or to look into it. Then one of the elders said to me, "Weep not. Lo, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered, so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals." And so one of the images that we have in the book of Revelation is the imagery of this scroll. And a scroll, of course, is the predominant method of formal written communication in the first century. It was made from papyrus leaves that were pressed together after they had been dried, and putting all the different leaves or pages together with a little bit of glue would create one continuous long writing surface, and this would be rolled up after it was used as a way to preserve it. Another thing that papyrus was be used for is for communication from a king to a general in command, for example, on the field of battle. And in order to assure that the information had come directly from the king, there would be a seal placed on it. Wax would be melted and then placed on top of the part where the page attaches to the scroll, and then it would be sealed with an imprint of some kind, usually a mark a coat of arms or something of this nature, similar, a ring. Sometimes the king would have a signet ring, and he would press the face of that ring on top of the wax, and it would be his image. Anyone who looked at that seal after it had dried would know that this was the image or the seal of the one who sent it, the one who had authority to send it. And while it certainly would have been possible for any person to break the seal, you only did so if you were addressed as the person that had the authority to open the seal. You dare not open someone else's letter. It's just like getting a letter in the mail, and it has its seal on it, or the flap of the envelope has been glued to the back of the envelope, and if it's not addressed to you, you don't have any plan to open it. It's not legitimately yours to open. And so John was wanting to know what was inside the message of this scroll, and he looked around and there was nobody worthy to open the scroll. And so this, of course, made him extremely frustrated and sad, because he was anticipating getting the knowledge, what was going to be revealed to him, and also to share with the 7 churches of Asia, and he wanted to obtain that information. But there was no one to open the scroll until one of the elders said to him, "Don't cry, don't weep. The Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered, and he can open the scroll and its 7 seals." On the screen here, you see a depiction of what this might have looked like, where you would have portions of the interior scroll sealed, and then the scroll would continue on the outside, and then another seal would be placed. And then you would continue to roll the pages and the papyri together until you had enough information for a 3rd seal, and so forth until there were 7 seals. And so it seems that when you break each seal, you're able to read a certain portion of information, but only up to a certain point. Then you have to break the 2nd seal in order to continue to read that papyrus scroll. Well, this is the way I envision this to have looked like, as you see on the screen here. And there are other artist depictions and maybe even graphic photographs of some kind to show what it might have looked like. Other artists depict it as just 7 straight seals on the same backside of the scroll. And that would be basically where you could not even open any part of the scroll until you broke off all 7 seals. And so in the drawing or the diagram, the depiction you see on the screen before you, you have a little more information as to how it probably looked, where a portion of the scroll could be opened only until the next seal would be broken, and then you could open more information and read more information until the 3rd seal would be broken, and so forth. There's a lot of discussion among scholars and commentators as to what this scroll was all about. Some people, like J. Adams in his commentary, thinks that this scroll was really sort of like a judge's verdict at a courtroom that is handing down the sentence from the judges because of the people that were killing all of the Christians and all the righteous blood that had been shed. And we read perhaps something about this in the 23rd chapter of Matthew, about verse 35, where you think that the city of Jerusalem is going to be the one who is judged because of this bloodshed that they gave against Christ and his Christians. J. Adams is taking a strict preterist interpretation where he views the destruction of Jerusalem as the fulfillment of all of the prophecies in the book of Revelation. That is one interpretation, and it falls within the preterist system of interpretation that we've been talking about. It's not the only view, and indeed there are good arguments against that view, as we've been talking about. Another interpretation views if you take a futurist interpretation, like a dispensationalist interpretation where people are thinking about the book of Revelation predicting the future, then you would think of this as the title deed to earth itself, And all of this is going to be the title deed for earth going to be referring back to God's people, and instead of all of the earth dwellers that had dominion and power over it at this point. And proponents of this interpretation would be like Hal Lindsey in his late great Planet Earth, John Walvoord, other dispensationalist authors and commentators that would say this, that this would be like real estate that had been lost, but could also be redeemed. And so Leviticus chapter 25 might provide some information about that as well. So it seems like John is using imagery taken from the Old Testament and applying it more currently to his own situation. Let me give you an example of another example of this. When I was a student at Florida College many years ago, I took a course in the book of Revelation with Brother Jenkins, and some of you might kind of tell this drawing is supposed to be depicting Brother Jenkins, and my colleague, my fellow student, Rick Hubbard, wrote this information as we were studying the book of Revelation, and he wanted to use some of his own language for taking the New Testament language and some of the imagery from the Old Testament as well, and putting it in the context of late 20th century biblical studies on the campus of Florida College. I was in the Bible lecture room on test day, and I heard a voice that spake to me. And having turned, I saw 7 golden overhead projectors, and in the midst of the projectors I saw one like unto a son of audiovisuals, clothed with tan pants and a brown blazer, girt about the neck with the brown striped tie. And his hair was brown also, but graying on the sides. And his eyes were covered with a pair of silver-rimmed glasses. And his feet were shod with patent leather, as if floorshime. And his voice did not reflect his Alabama heritage. And in his right hand 7 magic markers of various colors, and out of his mouth proceeded a multicolored transparency, and his countenance was one who spoke with authority. And when I saw him, I fell at his feet as one dead. And he laid his right hand upon me, saying, Fear not, for the test is postponed. So you see, the imagery and the language of one text can easily be applied to another text, and this is an example of certainly an uninspired writing, but certainly one that could be taken in good humor, especially when you consider the anxieties of college students getting ready to take a test with Brother Jenkins as the professor. We come back to our text in Revelation 5. One of the interpretations of this scroll is that it might be the Lamb's Book of Life. And there are other passages in the book of Revelation that allude to this idea in chapter 3 and verse 5, in chapter 13 and verse 10, verse 8 through 10, in chapter 20, in verses 12 and 15, and also in chapter 21 and in verse 27. Now, it's possible that this scroll is the Lamb's Book of Life, and that the reason that it was written upon both front and back is because there were so many names written in the Lamb's Book of Life. And that's certainly one interpretation, and is possible. My own personal view is that the contents of this scroll has to do with the information that is going to be taking place in this vision that John is receiving, and it's going to detail step by step what's going to take place in the future, or the immediate future, depending on what your particular perspective is on the date of the book. And so as we proceed with the chapter, in chapter 5 and verse 6, notice what the vision continues to say. And between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders I saw a lamb standing, as though it had been slain, with 7 horns and with 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. And he went and took the scroll from the right hand of him who was seated on the throne. And when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp, and with golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. Now we'll talk about the contents of their prayer and the song in just a moment, but I did want to pause and talk a little bit about who this Lamb is. As we think about the writer of this book being the Apostle John, most likely it's the Apostle John, and he was exiled on the Isle of Patmos off the shore near Ephesus. He's having this vision, and he speaks about the Lamb, and the Lamb with the 7 eyes. Now, of course, that's a very obscure type of imagery. We have to kind of think about what that might look like. It would be very grotesque to see a lamb with 7 eyes. Normally, they just have 2 eyes, as you see on this photograph. But if you can imagine a lamb with 7 eyes, the whole purpose of any kind of eye is to see and to have a good vision of what's before you. So keep in mind that the book of Revelation has a lot of imagery, and 7 is a very symbolic number. The number 7 would indicate completion or perfection. And so if you have 7 eyes, then you have perfect vision. You can see the future perfectly. You can see what's about to take place perfectly. And of course, the Lamb refers to Jesus himself. In the Gospel of John, the writer John, the apostle, talks about Jesus, and he's describing him as he does his ministry among the disciples. And when John the Baptist was viewing Jesus, he said, "Behold, the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world." So John the Baptizer understood the identity of Jesus as the Lamb. That is, one who is going to be slain, one who is going to be sacrificed. And yet in that particular sacrifice, he's going to accomplish something great. He's going to take away the sins of the whole world. So he saw the lamb standing as though it had been slain. So that's kind of a difficult image to wrap your hands, the idea about, because when a lamb has been slain, he's going to be falling down on the ground, not really standing. So the imagery is, it implies something, that if this lamb had been slain, well, for whatever reason, he's able to still stand up again, as if he had been resuscitated or raised up. And he has 7 horns, which would indicate power, something that would be fearsome, and 7 eyes. And he also interprets it here, these are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. 7 eyes and 7 horns indicate something that's going to be sent out as a commission, something with power, something with vision that can see perceptively, perfectly clear as to what's going to take place. And so John was frustrated at first as to who was going to be worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals. But now he knows that it's going to be the Lamb of God that is going to do this. And the scroll is going to be taken. The 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. Why? Well, because he's the worthy one. He is worthy of worship. He is worthy of praise. He is worthy of singing a new song. And of course, that's what they're doing here. In verse 9, it says, they sang a new song. The lyrics of that new song have to do with the fact that the Lamb was worthy. Worthy art thou to take the scroll and to open its seals. For thou wast slain, and by thy blood didst ransom men for God from every tribe and tongue and people and nation, and hast made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth. Now, this is going to be an indirect moment of hope for the Christians that are first reading this book or having it read to them and understanding the message. They were living in a time of persecution, whether we think about this in the time of Nero in the late 60s or in the time of Domitian in the mid-90s. Both of these individuals were guilty of persecuting Christians. When we examine the history books, it seems as though Nero was pretty much focused on persecuting Christians within the environment of Rome itself. Not so with Domitian. Domitian was wicked and extensive in his use of force, terror, and persecution, especially against Christians. And we'll talk more about this a little bit later. But the point is that whoever is reading this, and even those of us now living in the 21st century, as we are thinking about this book in the third millennium, it still applies today. It still has impact and power and a source of strength and endurance for us today, because while we may not be living in the time of Nero or in the time of Domitian or any Roman emperor, we are living in godless times. We are living in a godless society. We are living in a period of time when all things that are pointing to truth, godliness, righteousness are ridiculed and thrown aside as if it's not of value at all. And so the message to us today is also very powerful and strong. It gives us hope and strength because these individuals who have been persecuted are actually going to be the ones who are the ones ruling, and they are a kingdom and priests, and they will reign on the earth. Not these wicked powers that we see all around us, but Christians will be the ones who are victorious and will be reigning. And so really the time for us to think about this is now, and the message that was true in the first century is also true in the 21st century. It applies today in a timeless message that tells us that we must remain faithful to God and the principles of serving Him, no matter what source of persecution comes against us. Keep in mind that Christians of every generation will suffer persecution of some kind. And this is perhaps on a relative basis where some generations have less persecution of the Christians and other generations have more persecutions against Christians. As we look around us in the society that we see currently and contemporaneously, it seems as though the problems and the challenges and the persecutions against people of faith are being ratcheted up to another level. As we come to the last section of chapter 5, we find these words. Then I looked, and I heard around the throne and the living creatures and the elders the voice of many angels, numbering myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice, Worthy is the Lamb who was slain, to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing. And I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea, all therein, saying, To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever. And the 4 living creatures said, Amen. And the elders fell down and worshipped. Chapters 4 and 5 of the book of Revelation give us a glimpse into the throne room of heaven itself, where God is seated on the throne. And this is an imagery of earthly monarchies to give us the understanding. It is comparable It is like a king on a throne. And God, of course, is King of kings and Lord of lords. And he's in control of all the events that are taking place on earth. He's in heaven. The scroll is in heaven. The Lamb is in heaven opening the seals on the scroll, and the seals are going to be opened one by one, revealing the things that are going to take place, because this is the strategy room of a war that is taking place with heavenly implications. And yet the battlefield is on earth, and the ramifications and the implications of what's taking place is on earth itself. But the strategy, the plan, the dominion, the power, all of that is up in heaven where God is. And this imagery of the four living creatures and the 24 elders throwing their crowns before him who sits on the throne is indicative of the praise and the honor and the might and the glory that belongs only to God himself. And so the imagery we find is taken from the book of Ezekiel, as we saw last Sunday morning. And the image you see on the bottom of this slide is just one artist's depiction of the different images that are found here of the four living creatures that are reminiscent of an ox and a man and a lion and an eagle, because these creatures have tremendous power and authority in their distinctive realms. Certainly, we think about a lion as being the king of the forest, and we think about an ox as having the strength that no other beast of burden can compare. And the eagle flying overhead, majestic and high in the sky, beyond the reach of any creature that is bound to the terrestrial walking upon the earth. And of course, man himself, who has been endowed with tremendous power by the ability of his mind and his heart, his ability to think and to have great wisdom. And this is why the message is given to us in apocalyptic symbolic language, that we have the ability to understand the main thrust of the message as it comes to us from God. Keep in mind that the focus of this book is to give hope to Christians who were suffering in the first century. And they were in peril. And they had temptations too. The temptation to give up. The temptation to forfeit their faith. And as we shall see later, the temptation to worship Caesar, or to be involved in the emperor worship, which really came about in the time of Domitian. For joining us this evening as we studied the 5th chapter of the book of Revelation. We're going to be looking at chapter 6 on Sunday morning as we continue our study with this book of Revelation at the Citrus Park Church of Christ. And I invite you to tune into that. We will be presenting that lesson through live stream, and it will also be recorded and placed in archival form on our YouTube channel for further consultation. So these lessons are going to be here as a resource as you continue to study this marvelous and extremely interesting book. Thank you so much for joining us. May God bless you and take care of you